Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you today. My first trip to Australia, I brought one of my colleagues, our director of our Office of International Affairs, Mr. John Connolly, with me today. We recognize after what seemed to be an extremely long flight to Australia, in fact, we're in the air and on the ground for about 50-50. It's about 48 hours apiece coming from Washington. But what I'm stunned after meeting your AFP commissioner in Washington, D.C. last week, as well as your ambassador, how many things we have in common with Australia. The world is a much smaller place, and if we can be here in 20 hours from Washington, D.C., give or take, criminal networks, folks that seek to exploit our borders, our financial systems, make the world a very, very small place. And we've gone through a great deal of reorganization in the American government to combat transnational organized crime. We just celebrated at DHS our 10th year anniversary. DHS was born, I would say, out of the need to protect our borders in a new way. ICE is one of the 7 operating components in the Department of Homeland Security that is looking to investigate transnational organized crime across a broad spectrum of offenses. And what I find most similar and sort of surprising that we have in common is even an agency the size of ours, we seem to be dwarfed in comparison with the scale of the problem. It's amazing as large as the United States is, and certainly we have a partner in Australia because Australia is about the exact same size. The problem is nearly intractable. And unfortunately, I look at some of the things I'm going to talk to you about today. It's disheartening. The crime in the United States and as well as around the world and how that impacts civil society is truly a tragedy. But I am proud of the men and women at ICE and certainly all the folks and colleagues from around the world that are here today that we are fighting the good fight. It is traditional law enforcement that puts bad guys in jail and makes sure that society continues in a civil way. So even after having been with the agency since its creation and then with the Immigration Service before that, it'll be my 17th year in August, even from a perspective in Washington, D.C., I had to sort of take a step back when I sort of was gathering my thoughts for these remarks to sort of look at that international perspective. We know that the UN met in 2000 in Palermo and sort of has crafted a strategy for the international engagement against organized crime. The United States ratified that treaty in 2005, and we recognize that really is the Palermo Convention being sort of the first time putting a mark on sort of the impact of organized crime around the world. The scope of the problem is huge, and even the way it's defined in the convention as an organization of 3 or more people, and a serious crime being a crime punishable by more than 4 years in jail. Australia and the United States have sort of a very similar system in terms of the federalism model that we embrace. The terminology is a little bit different. We talk about state and locals and the feds, and we are the feds. But for you, the Commonwealth, and your states, it's a very, very similar system. We recognize, certainly in a country the size of the United States, and even ICE with about 14,000 law enforcement officers, we're dwarfed in comparison to our state and local partners. They are often the first responders. They are the ones who are the source of the tips. And it is only through that intersection of working with our state and local partners that we're able to make some of the cases that we make at the federal level. The strategy to combat organized crime in the United States has evolved. We certainly know that it's the narcotics organizations that have sort of led or been the spear as time has gone on that has sort of been the original source of, say, of the problem. But we also know that it is the financial benefit of crime that is what drives the organizations. And we also see, and we certainly see in a country the size of the United States, and I suspect you see as well in Australia, that criminal organizations care very little about the commodity. It doesn't matter whether it's narcotics, whether it is contraband of every type, and whether it is people. They will sell what they can sell to make a profit. and then they will launder those proceeds and take them back with them to the country where they are doing business from. The only way, at least from the United States perspective, we can even have a hope to win some of this war is to work together. One of the things I did before I came over to talk to you today is do my best to sort of understand your system. It's certainly not clear, I suppose, for folks what the Department of Homeland Security does, and then sort of what the constituent agencies within DHS, we call them the operating components, do. ICE is an amalgamum, which I'll explain in a couple of minutes, of two legacy agencies that were both focused on the border, but for different reasons. We have a Department of Justice. We have a Department of the Treasury. We now have a Department of Homeland Security. For the American people, and I think sort of very different than folks from Australia as well as the United Kingdom, the idea of Homeland Security was a new concept. Folks understood what our Department of Defense does, fighting to win wars. It was a very simple concept, very appealing. Folks could very easily understand that. The idea of Homeland Security was something that was a new concept, even to the American public, particularly in the aftermath of September 11th. We have sort of tried to define that for folks by saying Homeland Security is an enterprise that protects the American way of life and creates an environment in which it can thrive. And that is something that can't be done not only from Washington, D.C., but from even at our physical or maritime, or for that matter, our aviation border. That border has to be pushed out to our partners, to our colleagues around the world who also want to protect the sovereignty of their borders. And it's only working together through screening both people, commodities, virtual currency, that we can have, again, a chance to work together to attack organized crime. We've taken, obviously, an iterative approach, like every government does, to combat organized crime. We've certainly have seen it in the narcotics context and then sort of move forward. In 2009, our Department of Justice released our law enforcement strategy to combat international organized crime, which outlined what I'll say is the first set of concrete steps for United States law enforcement to attack organized crime. We recognize that DHS was created in the aftermath of September 11th when information was not shared the way it should be. No agency, at least I think from our perspective, wants to be that agency that won't share information. It's the world of the past. There's a natural competition in law enforcement. There's a natural sort of tendency to be proprietary with things. It is really a fool's errand. We know that it's not the world we live in. And again, I mean, the world, whether it's the economy or for whatever reason, just to stimulate global trade, the world is a smaller place, and sharing information is the only way we're going to be successful. In 2011, following on that 2009 strategy, our government released an updated strategy to combat transnational organized crime, to rebuild, balance, and integrate all tools of American power to combat transnational organized crime and the related threats to national security. One of the things that we've certainly seen, and whether it's procurement agents trying to buy dual-use military goods or other sensitive technology, again, criminal organizations will sell to the highest bidder. It doesn't matter whether it's alien smugglers that are smuggling migrants across our southern border in the United States to fuel a labor market, or whether they are smuggling folks who plan to do us harm for very different reasons. It's all about money. President Obama in 2011, using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, signed an executive order to block all property or interest of a designated member of a transnational organized crime syndicate that comes into possession of any U.S. person. My agency participates in enforcing that law. It is going after the assets. It is making sure that physical assets, electronic assets, financial assets are targeted to dismantle transnational organized crime. One of the things I appreciate that the AIC is doing, one of the things I was reminded of this week as we go into our very contentious budget debate for our 2015 budget, is that anecdotes aren't data. In law enforcement, we certainly talk about seizures, we talk about arrests, indictments, convictions, And we certainly can look at those successes and be very proud of them. And one of the things I'll go quickly over with you today are some examples of the investigative areas that ICE has had some success. But we certainly have a struggle when we go to our appropriators in Congress to fund our agency, show those highlights of those cases when they span fiscal years. When we say this investigation started in 2006, 2009, with what we call one-year money, folks want to see what we've done in that 1 year. It's very difficult to measure, but it is only looking at what I'll say is a more enlightened approach through organizations like AIC, where we have calculated new ways of measuring impact. We are taking a look at dismantling transnational criminal organizations over the cross of our investigative areas to measure that impact. We think that is the approach that we see in the future that makes sense for us, and I'll be happy to sort of talk a little further about that in the future. One of the novel approaches that we've taken, sort of expanding some of the financial tools, is in October 2012, an El Salvadorian street gang that is quite prevalent in the United States, Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, became the first transnational street gang designated by our Treasury Department as a transnational criminal organization. ICE and the Treasury Department work to do this. It is bringing our immigration authorities and our criminal investigative authorities together to target a group that is involved in a full range of crime: human smuggling, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, murder, assassinations, just across the board, extremely dangerous. It is by targeting their assets, which is the lifeblood of the organization, that we are going to bring them out of the United States and just dismantle that organization. The other thing we've done is not only designate the organization itself, but 6 of its top members were also designated as TCO targets. And it is through that targeting that we will cover, again, the full range of their assets. So with that sort of introduction to sort of lay the groundwork for certainly the American perspective, there's sort of 2 more things I would like to talk to you about. Just to make sense for an audience of international partners, what exactly is ICE? What exactly do we do, and where do we come from? And then the third part of my presentation is going to be just a brief overview of some of our key cases. So ICE, as we said, it's about a 20,000 strong organization, about 14,000 law enforcement officers. We have a couple of major, what I'll say is operational programs. And the first that I want to talk about is what we call Homeland Security investigations. Homeland Security investigations, about 7,000 what we call special agents or criminal investigators. We are the primary investigative arm in DHS. There are several other agencies in DHS that have criminal investigative program, but we are by far the largest in DHS, and we have what I'll say is, or we characterize as a broad range of authorities. The work that HSI, as we call it, and I will limit my use of acronyms as much as I can. We were out seeing some sites yesterday, and we saw SES on the back of some emergency responders trainees, and I immediately thought, gee, that's an acronym that we use, and it just is amazing. We sort of all have the same few letters lined up in a row that mean very, very different things. For us, it's a personnel system, but for you, it's emergency response or response trainees. But anyway, so I'm going to try to limit my use of acronyms. But HSI, as we call it, is primarily focused on the full range of smuggling crime. It is the 2 agencies or the 2 programs they came from was first the U.S. Customs Service. So in 2003, when ICE and DHS was created, there were sort of 2 investigative programs that were brought together. One from the Customs Service with a focus on merchandise, goods and wares of every description, monetary instruments in bearer form, and contraband. And then the investigative program for the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which was alien smuggling, human trafficking, documented benefit fraud. Those 2 programs came together. And certainly, in our view, the sum is greater than the parts. Bringing the border search authority from our customs investigative program, bringing the immigration authorities to question individuals at the border, a very, very powerful tool. Developing probable cause for folks that are not U.S. citizens, again, a very powerful tool. I'm sure folks are aware of sort of the tragedy we saw in Boston at the Boston Marathon this year. And I'm proud to say that ICE worked directly with the FBI. We were supporting what we call the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And our agents in two-man teams with the FBI agents went out to solve that crime. It's a dark day, certainly for the American people, but I am proud to say that at least one of the people responsible is being brought to justice, and ICE had a piece of that investigation. So smuggling crime, like I say, crosses every investigative discipline. Narcotics is the biggest piece of the HSI investigative hours. It is something that we struggle with in the sense, not only in sort of, I'll say, is the proactive investigations, but also in our reactive investigations. We have a very similar system that you have with AFP and the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service. We are the investigative arm of our CBP. So when their interdiction mission at the border, both at and between the ports of entry, find contraband, we are the folks they call. It's a challenge. They are about a 45,000 strong organization. They are staffing seaports, airports, again, ports of entry, and again, our border patrol between the ports of entry. And the southwest border is a vast stretch of land between Mexico and then our northern border with Canada. It's a big job. We work very closely with them. They have very similar authorities, but it is that tip that comes from that interdiction mission that often leads to cases that ultimately get investigated and prosecuted by Homeland Security investigation. The next sort of big operational piece of ICE is something we call enforcement and removal operations. These are law enforcement officers that are sort of very directly engaged in immigration enforcement. We also work with Customs and Border Protection, who are also immigration officers, at what I'll say is our physical borders, to screen people, and obviously folks who are admitted and can come to the United States lawfully are processed hopefully quickly, and folks that can't, if there is a detention function or removal function, that is a job that comes to ICE. It is a big job. It is certainly a controversial job. The American folks, similarly to what I see in your papers the last couple of days that I've been here, are struggling with immigration reform. It is something that the agency is obviously very focused on. It's going to have a direct impact on our mission. We do our best in what I'll say is a political football. There are folks that feel very passionately on every side of that debate, but the men and women of our enforcement removal operations do a very targeted job at making sure that the removals we do effectuate each year have the greatest impact on public safety. We have taken that focus, recognizing, at least in the United States, that there are estimates there are approximately 11 million unauthorized aliens in the United States, and ICE removes about 400,000 a year. What we have to manage that task, we have taken an approach that the first 400, it can't be the first 400,000. It has to be the 400,000 have the greatest impact of public safety. So we have a couple of programs in place, and whether it's through biometric screening, through fingerprints, working with law enforcement agencies, or our programs that we are physically located at county jails, federal prisons to screen releases for those who become deportable because of a crime. Those are the folks that we target first. I'm proud to say that several times this year we've had a couple of enforcement initiatives in ERO where we've targeted folks who have targeted children, drunk drivers, folks that present a direct risk to the American public as targets for removal. It is the right, good old-fashioned law enforcement approach to impact public safety. We have about 1,000 lawyers at ICE. I was one of them for a while. They litigate the removal cases before administrative law judges. It's a big law firm. It's about a $200 million program. Lawyers are difficult to manage, and even though I am one, I don't wear that hat anymore. It's a strong and necessary part of our organization. We also have an Office of Professional Responsibility We have criminal investigators that are detailed from our Homeland Security investigations that do criminal integrity investigations as well as our administrative investigations related to sort of personnel misconduct. We also do the criminal investigative part on behalf of CBP. And the interesting thing there is we often see, particularly in our Customs and Border Protection sister component, given the size, that transnational criminal organizations will often target customs agents and officers for corruption. And it is targeting those folks to let contraband come into the United States that is often a piece or a tip that ultimately comes part of a larger investigation that we investigate. It is a technique that organized crime syndicates use, and it's something that we have quite a focus on at ICE. The last three things I just want to mention about the agency that I think are important is first our IPR Center. We lead something called the Intellectual Property Rights Enforcement Center, or IPR. Commercial fraud and IPR are two strong focuses for ICE. It is space that we uniquely occupy for federal United States law enforcement. There's over 20 partner agencies at the IPR Center. We have partnerships with industry. But IPR and commercial fraud is one of those investigative areas that we struggle to support, and which is why we have to watch our execution of our hours, our investigative hours, in the narcotics context. Narcotics, again, I think is about 20% of our investigative hours, but in financial, I think is probably the next one down, and not by a close second. It's around 12 to 13%. We look at these other things, whether it's counterproliferation, intellectual property fraud, commercial fraud, as 4 to 5% of investigative hours. And it is only through that enforcement of intellectual property rights that makes all our economies strong and vibrant. People do not want to be innovative when it doesn't make economic sense to do it because folks are just copying their materials. We also lead something called E2C2, the Export Enforcement Coordination Center. We've had some reorganization in our government between the Department of Commerce, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Homeland Security to regulate the export of sensitive technology. And that's whether it's dual-use technology that has a defense component or just sensitive technology that is either on the munitions list or sensitive technology that's regulated by commerce. We lead that. If it crosses the border, it's something that ICE is very focused on. Our last thing that I'll just mention is our Border Enforcement Security Task Forces. These are task forces that are ICE-led that really run the range of law enforcement, both in the federal and state and local space. Our port in Los Angeles, where roughly 40% of the ocean-going cargo arrives on the American shores, we have a best task force in that context, in the maritime context. And when I was out there, the unit chief said with the 11 partner agencies, and again, for all the right reasons with the right facts, but he said, I can develop probable cause in anything that moves at this port. That's a very powerful tool. It is the only way, with the number of ocean-going cargo containers that you see coming through the port of Los Angeles, that law enforcement has a chance. We work very closely with our Customs and Border Protection on targeting. While we have 100% screening of people that come to the border, obviously in the cargo context, it is impossible to do that and speed commerce through our shores. Targeting is the key to that process, and then investigating the folks, or I should say the containers that are key to those threats is the way we work, and hopefully it's smarter and not just harder. So with that, sort of the ICE overview, I think it makes sense to sort of look at a couple of the cases that sort of typify our work in the organized crime arena. I think it does make sense to start in the narcotics context because it is where we have learned so many of our lessons, and it also is probably still, unfortunately for everyone, really the place that presents the greatest challenge. I just took a quick listen to our National Public Radio this morning, and there was a story from our Office of National Drug Control Policy about the drop in cocaine demand in the United States. And that is very likely on the demand side. It has certainly had an impact on law enforcement in Colombia. But this case, it was called Operation Pac Rim, from our New York office, represents at least ICE's contribution to dismantling transnational organized crime in the narcotics context. This cartel was responsible at one time for moving 42% of the cocaine from Colombia into the United States. So with that, I'm going to try to move this slide over and talk about...
ICE agents told us the super cartel supplied 42% of Colombian cocaine in the U.S., some 900 tons over 7 years. Much of it grown here, in the verdant coca fields that blanket central Colombia. We went with Colombian police commandos called junglas and U.S. ICE agents on a series of raids to destroy drug labs linked to the super cartel. Across streams, through dense vegetation, the junglas led us toward a crude structure hidden beneath the jungle canopy. In Colombia, Steve Klepe is the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent in charge.
How important is a lab like this to the cartel?
It's tremendously important. In the supply chain, this is step one. And you'll find these type of clandestine labs closest to the cocoa fields themselves.
The piles of coca leaves you see here are the source of the cartel's vast fortune. Inside these big barrels, the leaves are soaked with gasoline and toxic chemicals to make unrefined cocaine. There are thousands of labs like this across Colombia. They're easy to build and easy to conceal. The commandos set a series of explosive charges throughout the makeshift structure and directed us to a nearby coca field, where we watched the jungle lab go up in smoke.
So part of that represents a little bit of the past. Unfortunately, the cocaine problem is by no means solved. What's important to look at this is how this case started. This case started with our International Affairs Office, folks working in Bogota, Colombia, who targeted fertilizer shipments at Colombian ports. And what they found, working with our Transnational Criminal Investigative Unit, folks with the Colombian police, was $41 million shrink-wrapped in bulk fertilizer shipments. It is those customs authorities that, working again with our Colombian partners, that led to the beginning of this case. We recognized, of course, that even though we estimated about $5 billion in proceeds had gone back to Colombia, that the case was not simply between the United States and Colombia. We worked with our offices in Mexico City, in Europe, and North Africa as we found and investigated various routes for cash and drugs. In 2010, working with our partners in the Department of Defense, we intercepted a submersible sub near the Galapagos Islands between the the Ecuadorian and Colombia border, carrying 1.5 tons of cocaine. In April of 2011, working with the Spanish National Police and French authorities, we seized 450 kilos of cocaine concealed in a sailboat intercepted off the coast of Guadalupe Island. What's important is the boat was crewed by a Mexican and 2 Bulgarian nationals. It shows the breadth of the organization. This investigation continues around the world as we further look for other leaders of the cartel, and we will continue to dismantle that cartel until it is absolutely gone. The interesting, just the final total, so for to date, is about $173 million seized, about 3.3 tons of cocaine, 31 indictments, 34 arrests, and 17 convictions. We've also had some success working with our Australian partners, also in narcotics cases. I'm just going to give you one example from something we call the cruise liner Aurora case. It's a case that started in San Francisco. We were working with CBP hand in hand, and we see some unusual behavior from some of the passengers on the ship bound for Sydney. Through our normal screening process, targeted these folks and found 13 kilos of cocaine among the 3 passengers, 1 Australian national and 2 nationals of New Zealand. Knowing the case could continue, we immediately, through our Singapore office, contacted our colleagues in Australia and New Zealand. When the ship arrived in Australia, folks from the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service, arrested a citizen of the UK with 25 kilos of cocaine after a narcotics dog alerted to him and his luggage. He had 5 kilos of cocaine strapped to his body and 25 kilos in his cabin. I'm happy to report that all of the defendants pled guilty and were sentenced for between 3 and 5 years in prison. In my view, that does not seem like a very long amount of time, but again, it is, we'll take it. At least we found it. The thing that I sort of note is in terms of the financial piece of that case, dollars from the Pac Rim case, is the next case that we also see that arose sort of in the narcotics context. We call it HSBC. Another case run out of our New York office targeted what we call trade-based money laundering, or BMP, the black market peso exchange. This investigation revealed that Colombian and Mexican drug trafficking organizations were using Mexican banks and casas de cambio to move proceeds from banks from Mexico into the United States, and it was often to pay bills of Colombian importers. The investigation revealed that between 2004 and 2009, HSBC repatriated more than $36 billion from Mexico into the U.S. for further credit to those Colombian importers. We believe the results of narcotics trafficking. Interesting that the techniques seem to not change all that much. Money laundering, whether it's bulk cash and money pickups, structuring to avoid our currency reporting requirements, wire transfers. In December 2012, a 4-count indictment was handed down in the HSBC case and accused HSBC of willfully failing to maintain an effective money laundering program and for willfully failing to conduct due diligence on its foreign affiliated banks. Violations for sort of statutes that were created originally for very different purposes, the IEPA statute, the Economic Emergency Powers Act, along with trading with the enemy. HSBC, I'm glad to report, admitted wrongdoing, forfeited $1.26 billion, $881 million was forfeited to ICE and its forfeiture fund, and our partner organization in this case, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, $375 million. They have an ongoing monitoring requirement with the federal government. Similar to HSBC, but on a much, much smaller scale, but sort of to show the international breadth, we have a case what we called E-Mule, a slightly different technique. In this case, a Vietnamese criminal organization is using students from Vietnam who are in the United States on student visas to steal U.S. identities and purchase goods for shipment to Vietnam where they are resold for cash. This is a case that has been, for the United States, designated as a top international criminal organized target or ticket case. And the technique here first involves, through social networking or intrusion, stealing identities. The second step is to buy high-end goods and ship them to Vietnam where they are resold for cash. I understand, as I was looking at my notes for this presentation, the term for this is called monetization. I didn't know what the term meant. I asked my Director of International Affairs. He didn't know what the term meant. Monetization is this technique. The other key piece here is digital currency. We see Bitcoin. In this case, it was us, ICE, working with a partner in Australian Federal Police and other law enforcement agencies, targeting the Liberty Reserve digital currency provider, which at the time was one of the biggest providers of digital currency. It is a new frontier in law enforcement. The digital currency does not have all the traditional hallmarks of currency as well as sort of the traceability. It is targeting that digital currency where it is being used for illicit purposes that will fund that funds the criminal organizations that we need to target to dismantle. To date, we've made 6 arrests in E-Mule and seized more than $25 million, and there have been a total of 21 arrests from around the world. The case I want to talk about is something we call Operation Holetna. This is one of the most disturbing cases, really of almost any ilk that one can imagine, but it does show a partnership around the law enforcement community in the world that certainly is heartening to the extent as this is just a horrible, horrible crime. The image here is a 2-year-old with a stuffed animal. It was found in 2009 when ICE agents and Massachusetts State Police executed a search warrant on the computer of a Mr. Robert Diduca. When the search warrant was executed, we found he had 30,000 images of child pornography on his computer, including this one. This image was shared with Interpol. A law enforcement officer from the Netherlands saw this image and recognized that that stuffed animal was unique to the Netherlands. It was on TV in the Netherlands. It was traced to a daycare worker, Mr. Robert Michelson. He was accused of molesting 87 children. He was arrested and prosecuted. This investigation next led to the Philippines, where the Philippines National Police and ICE executed search warrants and made arrests for the production of child pornography. The investigation also led to Mexico, to a Mr. Raymond Marquez Herrera, who was sentenced, and again, you're going to be disappointed, to 12 years imprisonment. He was found to have the largest collection of child pornography ever found in Mexico. The case also led back to Boston, in what is only the most gruesome terms possible, to a Mr. Jeff Portway. He was arrested and found in possession of a child-sized freezer, scalpels, a coffin, a cage, and castration tools. I'm pleased to say that Operation Aletna to date has produced 54 arrests, 19 in the US and 35 around the world, and 167 victims identified and rescued. What I'm proud to say, ICE has taken a new tact in child exploitation by what we call a victim-centric approach. We're seeing more and more images of what we would say new exploitation. And our first step is to find and rescue victims that are currently being abused. We just recently, about a week or two ago, had Operation iGuardian, where we rescued victims. We had something called Operation Sunflower, where through executing a search warrant, we found a blurred image of a road sign, that through computer forensics we realized was a state flower of Kansas. It was a sunflower that is on their highway signs. ICE agents drove up and down the highways in Kansas to find that location, which they did. Once they did, through state and locals, they found a girl who was about to be raped by her stepbrother. And we were able to rescue her before the rape occurred. And the way we found that out is through chat rooms when the brother was on an international organization or sponsored chat room seeking advice on how to rape his stepsister. It is among the most righteous work in law enforcement, and particularly the most gruesome in every possible way. We are confronted at ICE. We've been sort of working with our research and development partners on darknet, folks are using the onion router and other sort of techniques to hide their identities. It is a struggle for law enforcement to work in that realm, but we are committed to doing the best we can with our limited resources to bring those people to justice. The last thing I want to just mention is the Virtual Global Task Force. ICE just inherited the chair of that organization from the AFP. It is a great organization that is expanding its membership from folks around the world. Again, we are working with our partners to bring that victim-centered focus to the VGT. And we also, at ICE, are targeting child sex tourism. Through our partners at our CBP, we are looking for Americans that are traveling abroad to have sex with children and targeting and prosecuting them before they can travel. Again, some of the most righteous work in law enforcement. So with that, and again, rather a somber note for a Monday morning, but certainly one that certainly puts the gravity on your conference and the very, very important work that we are all engaged in. and I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. We certainly have a lot more in common than we have in different, and ICE is very proud to be a partner with our partners around the world, including our hosts, the Australians, and you have my deep thanks for inviting us here to present on ICE.